Is this the best Space Marine I've ever painted? I think it might be, and I'm going to show you exactly how I painted my Dark Angel's Grand Master, Azrael. Little old metallic Azrael has been due a glow up for a while, and in April 23 he got exactly that and crossed the Rubicon Primaris. After the release of Leviathan, I have been painting more of my Dark Angels minis, and it feels like it is finally time to paint our Chapter Master. As always with my green Dark Angel Marines, I prime the model in black. I do this as the armour is quite dark, so it helps to start from a darker point. To get the gradients and basic shapes in place for the armour, I'm going to use an airbrush, but the rest of the model will be done with a brush only. I start by spraying a layer of Caliban green over all the exposed portions of armour. I quite like that there is so much cloth and hidden armour on this model. It is quite a nice change of pace. Once I've sprayed all of the base coat, I then use Vallejo's flat green and spray pretty much only from above, so that the darker green is being left in all the shadows. This helps to build up the shapes, and I don't fully clean out my airbrush between these two steps, as it will help to partially mix the colours in my pot. The brightest colour that I use is going to be moot green, and I am going to apply it in the same way that I did with the flat green, but covering a smaller portion of the model. Previously I would have mixed a little bit of ice yellow with this green for the final airbrush layer, however this has been making my Dark Angels look too bright and leave them looking more like the salamanders, so for this paint job I decided to take a slight step back. Now I'm going to get out a smaller detail brush and make a wash-like paint from Vallejo's purple. I do this simply by adding water to the paint and thinning it on my wet palette. Once I am happy with the consistency, I move over to my model for some panel lining. After mixing the paint, the bristles will often have a big drop of water on it, so I make sure to wipe off some of the moisture on a paper towel so that I don't flood the area that I'm going to be painting. I simply use this paint along the edges of panels to help separate them. This small step can really make a big difference as it introduces some nice contrast and helps your eyes to easily tell apart all the components. After having done this panel lining, we are going to do the opposite and start some edge highlighting. The first colour I use is a mix of flat green and moot green. I'm using this paint on almost all of the edges that are available, but I'm not going to bother on pieces that wouldn't get any light, like under his gun arm, as it doesn't make much sense that it would be well lit. I then do a second edge highlight using moot green by itself, starting to focus on all of the upward facing edges, as these will be receiving more light than the rest. The last colour I use for edge highlighting is moot green and ice yellow. This is mainly used on corner pieces and the very highest points, as it is the most extreme highlight. It is at this point I am willing to call the green armour done. The next part of the model I want to tackle is the robes. I want the robe to change from red up around the chest to purple down by his feet. For this I will use Corn Red by Citadel and Vallejo's purple. I start by covering most of the bottom half in the purple. I am moving pretty quickly with this as I want to ensure that the paint remains wet for a while. I then use the red on all of the areas under the belt, going down to the purple. I then set about wet blending the two colours to create a nice transition between the two. If you want to see a more in-depth video on wet blending, I will pop a link to my video on the subject in the description below. I jump back and forth between the colours to ensure I get a decent coverage, as the paints are quite thin to ensure they stay wet enough for the wet blending process. After the blend is at a place I am happy with, I use some Corn Red on the parts of the robe above the belt. Next I sketch out the areas of purple that I want to be a bit brighter. I use Genestealer purple and quite messily paint on the raised parts of the robe. Flowing cloth like this often lifts and dips in a wave-like shape, so I like to exaggerate the shape by highlighting the upper parts whilst leaving the dips much darker. Once the highlight areas are clearly marked, I get some water on my brush and start to thin the edges of the Genestealer purple, which will help it blend into the colour beneath it. This is quite a messy step, but I think of it as organised chaos, because it usually turns out looking okay. To give the purple a final push, I use Genestealer purple with a little white to edge highlight the open seam and bottom edge of the robe. In order to highlight the red portion, I mix the corn red paint with Jacaro orange and start to pick out some of the bunched up bits that are more raised than other areas. This again really helps to clearly show the shapes that have been sculpted into the robes. I then do a second layer using slightly more orange and focusing on smaller portions of the robes. Lastly, I use Troll Slayer orange by itself to edge highlight the seam of the cloth. Using a different red now, Mephiston red, I base coat the massive gun that this guy is somehow wielding in one hand. I also go around the model and pick out the wax seals for the participation badges. Make sure to double check this step as I always seem to miss at least one on my first attempt. As we have now picked out the wax seals, we may as well base the parchment on all the guys' little participation badges. To do this I use Xandri Dust. As this is such a light colour compared to the black primer, this does require a few coats to ensure a good even coverage that isn't letting any of the black through. And although I don't film it, I also decide to base coat the inner section of the robe with this colour too. It was at this point I realised that I had not yet drilled out the barrel of Azrael's gun, which as we know would get me in a lot of trouble on the internet, so I get out my little pin vise thing and make a nice little hole for bullets to come flying out of. Even the mighty Space Marines need to wear something underneath all this armour, and that can be seen in the elbow crease of Azrael's sword arm. I paint this and the little tube in front of his face in a black base paint. Even though I use a black primer, these parts are a little green from the airbrushing, so they need to be brought back to black. Next I move on to metallics, and I'm going to start with silver. As I want a darker still colour, I use lead belcher on the vents on Azrael's backpack, the non-red parts on the gun, and what looks like a voice changing device in front of his face. I like the idea that he's always messing about and changing his voice to sound like Bane or something. For all of the gold parts I use Retributor armour. In the box art, the wings on the chest and shoulder angels are white, but I decided I want these to be entirely gold to make this guy look even more important than he already is. The parts that I paint gold are the chest and shoulder decorations, the hilt of the sword, the skull caps on the backpack, the decorations on his forearms, the metal parts of the banner pole, and the thingy-majigs hanging from his belt. Once I am happy that I picked out all the metallic components, I get out my Nuln Oil and wash all the metal parts that we just painted. I then wait for the wash to fully dry and apply a second wash on all the golds. I do this because I really want to mute this gold, so I can create some dramatic contrast with some highlights. As we're going to be waiting for the wash to dry, I think it's a good time to also use a sepia wash on all the parchment parts of the participation badges. This helps to yellow it a bit and accentuate the shape of the paper. Once dry, I start to do some edge highlighting on the parchment, starting with the base colour from earlier, Xandri Dust. I do a couple layers of highlighting, mixing a little bit of bone colour each time to increase the contrast. Going back to the gold, I use Retributor armour again to make all the highest points and ends of the feathers and stuff nice and bright. Now, when it comes to painting power swords and faces, I personally don't think that I'm skilled enough with this particular subject matter to sit here and tell you how to do it. With that in mind, I've decided not to actually film this part of the model, and instead I'm going to really focus on improving and kind of developing my skill set with those particular things. If you like how it turned out, please let me know in the comments down below, and I might consider doing a video on either faces or power swords, because I actually think they've turned out really nicely. And I have got plenty of other minis that I can use to teach those topics anyway. So I went ahead and painted the face, the sword, and some other little bits and bobs that needed finishing up. And now I guess it's time for the grand reveal. Thank you so much for watching this video. I hope you enjoyed it as much as I enjoyed painting him, and until next time, I shall see you later.